Hello everyone. Thanks to our panelists for finding time in your busy schedules to come in and join us today. And thanks to all the attendees as well. Many of you have joined us through Zoom. Many of you are also following us through live stream on Facebook. Thanks to all of you. Please feel free to write your questions and answer in the question answer box if you are following us on Zoom. We will take all the questions at the end so that you have the opportunity to discuss it with different experts from their different perspectives. So feel free to write your questions and your viewpoints there. Welcome to all of you for today's webinar on COVID-19 and perils and promise of big data. So this is a part of a series of workshops and webinars being conducted by Trinity Research in Social Sciences, which covers multiple schools and different aspects and from multiple perspectives ranging from economics to human rights, law, and business. We are trying to analyze and discuss with prominent experts from across the globe how specific topics and specific issues are being impacted by COVID-19. This week, we are discussing big data analytics, and how COVID-19 is going to impact this specific segment from industry perspective. We have three very distinguished panelists joining us today. We have Professor Dave Chatterjee joining us from Georgia, United States. Thank you, Professor Dave, for joining us. I understand it's pretty early in the morning there. Thank you for finding time out and getting up early in the morning for this webinar. Professor Dave is a tenured professor at Terry College of Business in University of Georgia. He's a renowned expert in the field of technology management and cybersecurity. He conducts workshops, webinars, and provides consulting to CXOs and firms across the world on cybersecurity and preparing firms to be resilient in terms of their security apparatus. We are glad to have Professor Dave here. And we also have with us Vibhu Goenka from India. Vibhu is an analytics expert. He works with EXL Services Limited. And Vibhu manages multiple teams and analytics projects across India and United States as well. It's quite late in the evening from Indian time, so we do have people from different parts of the globe. Thanks, Vibhu, for joining us at this late hour and even after a long, tiring day. Vibhu has been named as an emerging young leader by Economic Times in India, and he is a renowned industry expert in the field of analytics. Thanks, Vibhu, for your time and joining us here. Our third panelist today is Maximilian. Maximilian is assistant professor in the field of business ethics at Trinity College Dublin in the School of Business. Max's current research is an intersection of ethics and technology. He's going to talk about the ethical aspects of the apps, contact tracing apps, and what it means in today's date. So we have very different perspectives for you today. Just to give a brief background, set up this talk. The thing is, since the pandemic has started, we have been talking from different perspectives. And analytics, big data has taken center stage. It started off with the experts in the field of modeling. We have been talking about fields like how can we model this pandemic, and to trying to predict how far we are going and how to plan. That's very central. There's a lot of data is being collected about tracking, tracing people, and that's been found to be very useful. From business perspective as well, this abruptness has led to people moving online in a big way. Physical stores have vanished in a split second, and we are slowly getting back. But it goes without a saying that online commerce, e-commerce is going to be the big deal in future. A lot of activities. If I give a small example, in Ireland, we used to have all our driving licenses renewals and all of that physically for most part. In past 2 months, everything has shifted online. That has led to creation and collection of a lot of data online. So today we are going to discuss with our panelists those aspects itself from different perspectives. Vibhu is going to take us through what businesses are doing to enable firms and governments. As an analytic expert, what is he seeing in industry that is enabling firms and governments to handle such pandemics? The second talk today will be by Professor Dave. As a cybersecurity expert, this is going to be very interesting because, yeah, firms are doing a lot of things. They're collecting data, but what does it mean for business? What does it mean for consumers? What does it mean for all of us? Should we be happy? And what can firms do to inspire confidence in all their users to enable users of their platforms? And finally, we'll have Max, who is going to talk about the ethical aspects. Is it right for government to collect data? Where should they stop from? Those are various interesting questions that are going to be raised today. So without taking too much time, I think I'll now invite Vibhu to start. And thanks, Vibhu, for your talk. And yeah, please take us through what businesses are doing these days and how can analytics help businesses and governments.
Sure. Thank you, Ashish. So first of all, I would like to thank Ashish and Trinity College for giving me the opportunity to share my views on this pertinent topic, and I think in front of a global audience. So thank you so much for inviting me. So to set the tone, I would like to start with the story of Blue, which is a Canada-based artificial intelligence startup, which scans millions of news reports in 65 different languages, along with other relevant data sources, to warn regarding any potential dangerous outbreaks. And some of you would have read that they picked up on a cluster of this unusual pneumonia cases happening around a market in Wuhan, China, and flagged it as a potential outbreak on 31st of December, which was interestingly almost 9 days before the WHO notified the public of a flu-like outbreak in China. This small incident goes on to showcase the power of artificial intelligence and big data to reveal seemingly hidden trends using the vast variety of data and text available in the public domain. And this can be of wide use and help for brands, businesses, and governments alike. So moving on, I would basically like to first spend some time on how analytics and big data is almost directly helping in the fight against COVID-19. And then I would move on to more a industry or a vertical perspective. In the first one, I would basically cover 4 dimensions. The first being surveillance and contact tracing. Second being healthcare applications. Third one being developing innovative testing techniques. And finally, moving to personalized risk categorization. I think this would give us a good view of how analytics and big data can help directly in the fight against COVID-19. So moving to the first one, which is surveillance and contact tracing. There has been some success observed in containment of the pandemic in areas like South Korea and Israel, where technology tracking and contact tracing has been carried out both primarily using smartphones, card transactions, as well as security cameras. In Asia too, applications like Trace Together in Singapore and Arogya Setu in India are being used to locate, test, and potentially isolate the carriers of novel COVID-19 disease. These apps can be really helpful in segregation of localities by their degree of risk and would also prove beneficial for the individuals depending on their movements. So basis this, we can say that analytics would be a strong determinant for scenario planning to answer questions like how many beds might be needed in a particular area or a hospital? How long do we have to go through confinement or lockdown restrictions in a particular place? And let's say, what should be the strategy to start the process of gradual deconfinement in different areas? Just giving a sense of how surveillance and contact tracing can help in the fight against COVID-19. Again, briefly touching on healthcare applications, I think while the use of big data and analytics can definitely speed up research and start to finding a potential cure, I think what it is doing for the moment is identification of possible interactions between virus proteins and existing drugs through the use of techniques like neural networks along with medical science, which is helping in repositioning of some of the existing drugs to at least solve the problem of COVID-19 to a certain extent as an intermediate step as of now. And again, while I'm not an expert in this area, just to give a brief view of how analytics could also help in terms of healthcare applications. Another interesting topic that I wanted to cover was on developing innovative testing techniques. So I think, as all of us are aware, COVID-19 has strained testing capabilities worldwide. There is an urgent need to find economical and scalable ways to test more people. And I think academics from top universities across the world, and I'll take a specific example from India, are working on finding innovative testing methods. One of such techniques is basically non-adaptive pooling, which can test many samples using only a few tests. What is interesting is these are parallel tests rather than sequential binary testing or similar techniques that have been tried in some of the other countries. So just to give the basic idea behind the technique, the way it follows is samples from individual patients are mixed together to form pools. These pools are then tested, and then an undetermined system of linear equations is used to obtain a sparse solution. And this uses data science algorithms like lasso regression or sparse Bayesian learning to finally obtain individual viral loads. And the coefficient matrices are designed in such a manner so as to take into account practical considerations, have a rich combinatorial structure, which allows for efficient retrieval of the individual test results. And such a technique can be really powerful in countries like India and Brazil, where the pandemic curve is still on the rise and testing resources and capabilities are extremely limited. So just to give an example to show the effectiveness of this, if you have an area with a prevalence rate of almost 2.5%, you would be able to test almost 400 samples using as low as 63 tests. And even with high prevalence rates of almost 10%, which is now being seen in certain areas, you would still be able to test as large as 105 samples using just 45 tests. So again, the objective here was to showcase how different data science algorithms can help in developing innovative testing methods, which can prove really effective in terms of helping countries to use their limited resources and capabilities to test the maximum number of people. The last topic in this that I wanted to cover was on personalized risk categorization part, wherein using machine learning and artificial intelligence, a lot of data-driven firms in industries such as financial services, travel, insurance, retail, and media make personalized recommendations on what to buy and almost have adopted a personalized approach to even pricing, risk, and credit. Similarly, ML models can be trained to predict an individual's risk of suffering severe outcomes if infected, which would translate to basically the probability that somebody would need intensive care if affected, and also looking at the probability of death. So the kind of data which can be used to get to this would include basic medical history, presence of comorbidities such as diabetes, hypertension, etc., as well as the household composition. This clinical risk prediction could then be used to customize policy and resource allocation, either at an individual or at a household level. Another thing to note here is that data indicates that as high as 90% of the infected people are either asymptomatic or experience only mild symptoms. In theory, if we could reliably predict who those 90% people are, we would then be able to develop effective deconfinement strategies. These 90% deconfined individuals could also then help in what is being called as herd immunity. I think while a lot of countries are using age as the proxy for risk today, however, I think a more personalized, data-driven approach is required to make sure that you are able to classify people very accurately. And even small things like an individual, a young, healthy individual who's living with elderly parents having comorbidities should ideally be classified as high risk instead of being classified as low risk. So that's briefly giving a sense of how big data and analytics can help directly in the fight against COVID-19. Now I would move to the second section of the talk, which basically I want to talk about how big data and analytics can help different industries and businesses survive in the current scenario. And given my personal experience in the financial services industry over the last 7 to 8 years, I would like to specifically pick some examples from there to showcase how big data and analytics can add value to different organizations in the current times. So then again, picking up different examples here. So the first point I would like to pick up is sort of creating augmented product value propositions and relevant campaigns in the current time. So I think what I've been trying to see working with different financial services organizations and let's say credit card companies is that depending on the real-time changes in the spending and consumption patterns that they're seeing because of the COVID-19 scenario, I think existing value propositions that a lot of these firms and their services have, for example, that of a premium travel credit card, might become completely obsolete. And hence, I think it becomes very, very important that these firms are able to modify the kind of value proposition that they're providing their consumers today, and also run relevant campaigns and offers which make the customer interested in the current scenario based on the current kind of trends that they're seeing. Also, I think proactive engagement with high value, high risk customers becomes much more important compared to a business as usual approach. Given the high likelihood of customer attrition in the current phase, analytics could help in proactively reaching out to the consumers to bring a large value to the firm, but also possess a high risk of attrition. This use case is also very relevant, let's say, for the insurance industry, which would want to increase the persistency ratio for renewals right now by proactively reaching out to consumers and making sure that they're able to provide them flexibility in payments and make sure that renewals are happening. Moving further to the use case of portfolio risk management, I think with an anticipated decrease in the ability to repay loans and corresponding increase in the default rates, a strong data-driven approach to portfolio risk management becomes extremely critical, along with the utilization of macroeconomic scenario analysis. The analytics in this scenario could help in building credit default models specific to the current scenario and looking at the journey of the customer from different default segments to collections, helping them with available options like deferment or moratoriums, etc., being provided so as to manage the overall portfolio risk more effectively. Okay. So I'd like to take a specific example where in terms of governments and financial institutions helping to finance small businesses, where I think today we've seen a large number of governments rolling out relief packages and liquidity measures. I think analytics can help streamline and quickly execute this process of giving out loans to small businesses. So taking the example of Paycheck Protection Program, which is implemented in the US by the Small Business Association, where the government is providing funding for approximately 3 to 6 months of payroll assistance, given like most of the amount is getting utilized for payroll costs. As part of this program, almost 4.5 million loans amounting over $500 billion have already been disbursed. This has put revenue into the hands of small merchants and businesses who otherwise might have declared bankruptcy and also furloughed employees. So I think I've seen analytics playing a key role for a lot of these originating banks by streamlining the end-to-end process of this loan application, disbursal, and also the forgiveness of the loan using a host of techniques like natural language processing and process automation. What this has resulted in is swift payouts, helping over 93% of the applicants to get the loans quickly. Some other examples that I would like to cover, which would be valid for multiple industries, would be things such as optimization of call center operations, wherein today you could effectively utilize AI-driven chatbots and cognitive voice assistants to handle a large pool of generic queries and only transfer a handful of them to customer service executives. Again, just to pick a particular example, Rubik, a Tel Aviv-based startup, basically helps airlines reduce significant overload on call centers and streamlines passenger rebooking and refund process by using a mobile-based application driven by AI. So I think this broadly covers the different ways analytics and big data could help different stakeholders in the COVID-19 scenario, specifically looking at some examples from different industries. I would also like to call out while there have been significant advances in technology and data science algorithms over the last few years. I think a host of factors, such as the data being limited, having too much noise, and this also being a black swan event. What I've seen is some of the models which aim to predict the prevalence and extent of the disease still need to be taken with a pinch of salt. Also, I think there are a lot of privacy and ethical concerns with the use of personally identifiable data, which I think my co-panelists would also cover in some detail. All in all, I would like to summarize with saying that I believe big data and analytics would help different stakeholders, such as governments, policymakers, businesses, and individuals, to fight this pandemic together and come out stronger on the other side.
Thank you. Thank you, Vibhu, for the very interesting talk. That was fascinating to listen to you and to see how big data and analytics are being found to be useful for different industries, different verticals, and what kind of future we see in analytics. It's needless to say, this is the future from multiple perspectives, and for sure, firms across industries will be using different kinds of algorithms to plan and to approach consumers going ahead. Short statement to our attendees. We can see the different questions that are being rolled in. Please feel free to send in your questions. We will take all the questions at the end. Now, moving ahead, building on what Vibhu has been saying, and as Vibhu said, collection of this amount of data by different firms does raise multiple concerns on how this will be managed. How consumers can feel safe the data will be used properly. In that respect, I'd like to invite Professor Dave, who's a global expert in the field of cybersecurity, to present his views on what does he see going ahead. How can organizations prepare better? Thank you, Dave.
Well, thank you very much, Ashish. Thanks for the invite. I'm delighted to be here. Hope everyone can hear me. I will be sharing my screen so I can go through a couple of slide decks that will allow me to organize my thoughts. So if you would bear with me. I hope the deck is visible. So yes, this is a wonderful opportunity, and I would like to take this opportunity to, I'm going to skip my introductions. By the way, I will make the slides available to anyone who is interested. I've been working in the area of cybersecurity for a while, and it's been a wonderful journey. It's taken me to different countries, share my perspectives, learn from others, and this is yet another fabulous opportunity. Even these publications should be easily available if someone were to click on the links, and they are pretty current and relevant. Talking about the pandemic and the lessons that the pandemic has for all of us, the four things that come to mind is how vulnerable we are as individuals, as groups, as organizations, and as a nation. The more digitized we get, the more connected we become, and for everything that is good that happens, you pay a price for it. And in this particular case, there is a price to be paid for extreme digitization. On top of that, now with the push towards remote work, remote collaboration, this problem is going to magnify. And we have to get as good as we can to manage technology, to secure ourselves, to secure our data. Talking about preparedness, my research finds the level of preparedness is not where it should be. And the pandemic once again proved to us how the nations were not quite ready. They caught, the phenomenon caught pretty much everybody napping. The phenomenon also highlighted that a reactive approach doesn't cut it. A muddled, a lack of plan approach doesn't cut it. We have to be in a much better state of readiness if we have to effectively survive and thrive in the new digital and remote working reality. As you all know, as I said earlier, with digitization comes some challenges in the form of expanding attack surfaces, greater use of devices such as the IoTs and the wearables, and who knows what's coming next. The human vulnerability factor has always been there. Research finds that the 99% of the attacks are focused on exploiting these vulnerabilities. Such vulnerability gets further magnified as we start working remotely. As we provide individuals with more technology access, it makes it even more challenging to ensure that everybody is doing their part to secure data. I want to make another point here. When I go and deliver talks on cybersecurity, often participants want to know about the role of technology. And they recognize that I come from the field of technology, so they expect me to emphasize that it is really all about technology that's going to solve these kinds of problems. And my response to that is that's not quite true. We have to take a very holistic approach, an approach where we are managing people effectively, we are managing processes effectively, and of course, we are making the best possible use of sophisticated technology. So I wanted to also emphasize that as we prepare to manage in this post-pandemic as well as the current pandemic era, as we prepare to effectively handle a more digitized work environment, we must look at these three key elements: the people element, the process element, and the technology element, and find the right fit. I'm sure the people who make a living attacking sites are thrilled about this greater opportunity, because now they have more attack surfaces, and they are definitely very savvy, and they are increasingly using AI and other capabilities to make their attacks even more innovative. And that's another challenge that organizations are having to contend with. Just like we have the pandemic, we've had the cyber attack epidemic happening for a while now. No organization is being spared. No country is being spared. Everyone has to be in a high state of readiness, because everyone is in a perennial state of breach. Striving to mitigate the risks of cyber attack is the cost of doing business today. In fact, in my opinion, cybersecurity preparedness is emerging to be a strategic competency. We are familiar with the consequences of attacks. Organizations lose revenue, they lose opportunities, there's loss of reputation, there is a drop in stock value. But something even more bigger, more catastrophic can happen when infrastructures get attacked. Case in point, the pandemic. See what the pandemic has done to countries. They have brought everything to a screeching halt. The planners probably envisioned it, didn't quite believe it could happen. It happened, and they were caught by surprise. We cannot afford the other shoe to drop now. And what's the other shoe? The other shoe I see is a form of a cyber attack. It's very feasible, or it's very plausible. We can have bank failures. We can have nuclear attacks. We can have contamination of our key resources. The financial market could collapse. So when Warren Buffett made this statement that cyber attacks are a threat on par with nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, he couldn't have been more correct, and I couldn't agree with him more. Did I ever imagine that the pandemic was going to happen and would further validate this reality? So it is imperative that all of us recognize these challenges ahead of us, and we all have a role to play. I'm so glad that the pandemic experts are hyping these words and telling everybody that you do your part. That's exactly what I have been preaching to the corporate, that cybersecurity is not a problem to be solved by a cybersecurity team. Cybersecurity is not something that you can just outsource and live happily ever after. You have to make a commitment to it. It is part of your organizational core. It is part of your strategic competency, and you must devote resources, plus you must provide its oversight. I don't have the time to go through all the success factors which have emerged from my ongoing research for the last several years, but at a very high level, I have organized these success factors into 3 categories. And I like to call them commitment, preparedness, and discipline. So it has to be a multi-pronged and a holistic approach. We have to transition out of a reactive to a proactive approach. We have to focus on resiliency, quick recovery. Once again, let's take the pandemic. Which country can make the quickest recovery with minimal damage? Similarly, if an organization or if a nation faces or has to deal with a cyber attack, how quickly can they recover? Do they have those plans in place? Have they tested those plans? Mark my words, I'm using the word tested. Plans are plans. Plans need to be tested. If we don't test, when things happen, we are caught napping. The response is chaotic. And I'm sure I don't need to give you examples of how that is so true out there as we see for ourselves. Moving along, so these are several factors, and once again, I want to emphasize that there are several pieces to this complex puzzle of cybersecurity management, and technology is only one of them. We require committed leadership. Does that ring a familiar tone in the context of the pandemic? We need committed leadership. We need robust governance procedures. We need informed and motivated personnel. These are very important success factors, whether it's the current pandemic or a future cyber-induced pandemic. So finally, to connect with the focus of our discussion today, which is big data analytics. Well, data drives everything. It is very important to ensure that you have good data to make your decisions, to do your analysis. The good news is research finds significant progress in using sophisticated analytics techniques coupled with machine learning capabilities to detect threats, to predict threats, and to prevent attacks. That would be an amazing capability if organizational systems are able to proactively detect and mitigate cyber attack risks. Are we there yet? Not quite, but based on the data that I have been reviewing lately, we are inching and moving in this direction. Our previous speaker did a fabulous job sharing with us a lot of examples of how analytics are being used to help us deal with the current pandemic crisis. Similar capabilities will be leveraged to make us more secure from the standpoint of sensitive and qualitative data. In the interest of time, I will stop here. I appreciate the opportunity. And once again, here's my contact information. I'll be happy to take any questions offline. If you want a copy of the slides or articles, please reach out to me. It will be a pleasure. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Dave. It was fascinating to hear about cybersecurity, and also brilliant the way you connected cybersecurity preparedness with pandemic preparedness. And it is right; those firms who are ready, those firms who are prepared before pandemics, before cybersecurity attacks, will be the ones who will benefit the most when such attacks happen. I'm seeing a question from Daniel. As Daniel said, we will take all the questions together at the end. Thanks for your question, Daniel, and this is really interesting. But at this moment, I would like to segue to connect with Max's talk. So we have seen what Vibhu told us is that firms are doing their bit. They are increasing the reliance on different analytics algorithms. Countries are using tracking and tracing applications. Dave has told us it's necessary to be prepared to protect consumer data from such applications. But one fundamental question that is raising their head again and again these days is about ethical aspects of those applications, contact tracing applications. And so I would now like to invite Max to take the floor and talk about the ethical aspects of these contact tracing apps. Max.
Yes, thank you very much, Ashish. It's a pleasure to be here. And I actually realized that this is a good order in terms of I can connect well to what Vibhu and Dave have said. And so let me share my screen as well. I have prepared a short presentation, just a couple of slides. And as Ashish already mentioned, I want to concentrate today on contact tracing apps as one particular area that at the moment has received a lot of attention and is considered as a big hope and important. And I want to do this from the perspective of the concept of legitimacy. So I personally, as a business ethics professor, I sort of have a background in political philosophy, and you will see that sort of my notion of legitimacy that I'm using is very much driven by this perspective. So after a brief introduction, I will go into the question of legitimacy and COVID-19 apps, and I will conclude with a quick outlook. So what is the key challenge that contact tracing apps for COVID-19 are facing? I think you can view this as sort of two key issues here. And I would very much agree with what Dave just said. I could not really underline this more, that he said it's not only technology, it's also people and process. And that's absolutely right. And I think my presentation connects in this statement perfectly, because I will talk about process and people. So the key point really is we need a high adoption rate. We need at least 60% of people in a population of a country where the app is operating in order for it to have a meaningful impact. And on the other hand, we have a trust issue in terms of, in some countries, the government is not trusted much, or tech companies are not trusted much. And in particular, if we consider health status data or location data. Of course, the issue of trust is something that will vary depending on which country we're talking about, but from a European perspective, at least, it seems to capture this quite well, that we might trust government for some things, but for health data and location data, we are skeptical, it seems. And also for tech companies, we are skeptical. but we need sort of trust for the app to be adopted more widely. And so what I would propose here is to say that under these specific circumstances, the process, how these apps are developed and managed, becomes really central and essential to look at the process and to design it properly. And there we can leverage insights from business ethics research and also from my own research. So if we look at sort of the abstract model of a democracy, we would say in a reasonable democratic system, people can trust public and private actors once you perceive them as legitimate. So legitimacy is a key construct for us. It's of course not the only driver of trust. You might also just trust something for other reasons than that it is legitimate. But in that sort of political system, democracy context, it makes sense to make a strong connection there, I believe. But if we talk about a democracy and that sort of the rule of the people, for the people, by the people, as often said, of course, legitimacy rests on explicit or implicit consent of the affected. So you cannot implement any rule without having some connection to consent, be it representatives that have been elected in sort of an agreed upon process, or you directly ask consent of people, which we do a lot in data agreements or service agreements that we might use. And so what I would then say is, in order to have a legitimate COVID-19 tracing app, ideally you would involve a multi-stakeholder approach in development, operation, and oversight. So you would develop it in a way that includes voices, you would operate it in a way, and you would have oversight over it. And sort of this concept of legitimacy, I would now take it one step further, and the next slide has one table in it, and I will walk you through it. So no worries, it's a bit, it's much information on there, but all are sort of relevant constructs of legitimacy. And legitimacy in research is really quite an expansive construct. So of course, I made some choices here, and this does not capture the whole picture of legitimacy, but I think it captures key points. And you can see there is a distinction between input and output legitimacy. So we would ask on the input side about is the COVID-19 app development, operation, and oversight process, is it legitimate from an input perspective or an output perspective? And so if we look at inclusion, would be of course an important factor. You would ask yourself, are the relevant and affected stakeholders represented in the development group, for example, of these COVID-19 apps? And I would like now to use sort of the example of Germany, not because we do it greatly in terms of apps or something, just because that's where I'm currently living. And so for me, it's easier to give an insight into how in practice this would work. And if you look at in Germany, currently the app is not on the market, it is still in development, but in this week we will have more information about it. And it was developed in a public-private partnership, mostly by two private companies, Telekom and SAP. And they have consulted with researchers from some public research institutions in Germany, and of course also consulted with politicians. And so in that sense, that's one aspect, how inclusion was maintained. Procedural fairness is of course important. How can the stakeholders that have been involved, how can they participate? Then deliberative orientation, that's something about the process of exchange itself within the endeavor to develop the app or then later to operate it, which might be different teams, for example. And there you would hope for an atmosphere where values, interests, and preferences can be voiced, and you have an atmosphere that then can bring the most reasonable solution to the fore. Transparency, of course, is a key factor. So openness to the public about the process itself. So all these factors that we talked about, are they open to the public or not? And in Germany, the transparency on these issues is not as high as it could be, I would say, because it's not easy to find out information about it. For example, what is good is that the source code of the app is now sort of officially available since I believe 1 or 2 weeks, and it can be discussed openly by experts, of course. And the process sort of will, after the app will be launched, then they will involve more stakeholders. But you could say they could involve them even earlier on and be more transparent about it. And then the second aspect of output. So I think the key point maybe is efficacy, if you like. So does the app actually work? So after it has been developed and deployed, does it work? Do we actually achieve these contact tracing efforts? And does the app have the relevant features? And there, of course, which kind of data is collected? How is it collected? How long is it saved? Who has access to it? Do we have a centralized or a decentralized solution? These are aspects that would come into play here. Again, transparency about the performance. So you would expect that there are reports. You can access a website to see, does it work? What are the metrics for it? Who has decided over these metrics? So you would like to know that, of course. And accountability, a key aspect. So who is responsible for what, and who can be made responsible if something goes wrong, more importantly, and sort of how is misconduct, if it happens, how is it sanctioned and verified? So these are all important factors that an ideal multi-stakeholder process would sort of need to take into consideration. And in Germany, in terms of efficacy, it's hard to say anything because the app has not even launched. I will go into examples in just a second. So this is, of course, a process, an ideal process, and you might say, well, this might take time, and we do not have the time. I will address that point in a second. But first, let me reflect quickly on, so if we say multi-stakeholder, for sure, what is most likely is that we will have a public-private partnership. Since mostly tech companies do have the capabilities, and Vibhu was very clear about what capabilities are out there. And on the other hand, governments do have the authority and the capability in terms of handling a pandemic. And for the app in particular, one interesting recent development was that smartphone operating systems, Apple and Google both developed an API for these contact tracing apps. And of course, smartphones are the key tech sort of tool for contact tracing apps to install the app on. And so it's a key gateway, the operating system. And they made sort of a concerted effort to improve that. And if we now look quickly on the international adoption, so you would say it would be ideal to have coordination on a global level and at least a European level. Shouldn't we maybe agree on one way to do it? It's extremely tough. It's a very fragmented picture at the moment. So, and in Europe, actually, most apps are just starting, are in the process of being launched. So it's not easy to make any statements on which approach worked better. But generally speaking, we see two approaches, the centralized and the decentralized option in terms of, is the data managed on a centralized database, or is the data managed decentralized on each device and only on the device. So in Italy, actually it's today that the pilot app starts in Italy, and it uses the Google Apple API and follows a decentralized design. And Germany will have a similar app than Italy's in terms of also using Google Apple and a decentralized approach. But France, for example, started a bit earlier, I think a week earlier, and they have a centralized solution. And they did not use the Google Apple API, for example.
Max, sorry to begin here. I'm the timekeeper.
Yes, I'm finished in a second.
Sure,
I'm finished.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry for beginning.
No, it's okay. And if we look at Singapore or Australia that were quicker, you can see that the download rates remain low. So 30% of smartphone users, that's of course not a big time. And so to close, sorry for being a bit over time. So what I think is it really can be a chance to use this crisis as an opportunity to impose and create an updated governance regime for big data with more legitimate processes. But I would also say that sort of the technological fix is maybe easier to achieve the purely technological question, what is the best app in terms of functionality, than the political challenges involved that sort of my brief talk has just sort of touched upon what would be important areas there. And with that, I thank you for the attention and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Max, for that interesting talk. And thank you all for sharing your views. I'm seeing we have some very interesting questions that are being discussed on the chat as well as submissions. Please feel free to send in your questions. But I would like to just start with Max with the point that you were making. So the whole concept of legitimacy and transparency stuff, you have presented from the perspective of these contact tracing apps that many countries are launching. But am I right to state, Max, that the same concepts would be valid for corporate applications as well, as we are seeing more and more firms going online, launching their applications, stuff like that. So similar concepts, similar or to some extent, same levels of legitimacy, transparency, or belief with consumers is required so that consumers download those apps, because everyone is worried what you will do with my data.
Absolutely, that's completely right. And I would say that it's lacking. We see that now at the moment we just sort of we download the apps because we want to use them. We think they are important, or for us they really are important, and then we use them and we accept that we do not have a lot of transparency how the data is used, how the algorithms behind it work. And so I think there, in terms of the social media discussion and how it influences elections, for example, we need oversight. And I really believe that sort of such a multi-stakeholder oversight body needs to be created, but not by the companies themselves alone, but really involving the different stakeholder groups. But until recently, governments have not taken this path. And of course, they sort of on the technological level are not the stronger entity, because Facebook and Google and Apple, they are developing these things. They know how it works. They can find workarounds. And so I think this pandemic might be a moment where these two, with a power differential. So the tech companies have an advantage in terms of knowing the technology, but governments now, they sort of need to find a level. And if they use this opportunity the right way, there could be a new governance mechanism how this is handled.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. Now I would like to invite Dave and Vibhu. We have a very interesting question from Daniel, and I'd like to rephrase Daniel's question a little bit to make it more interesting. So what Daniel just typed out in the chat is about trade-off between big data and security perspectives. So from what I understand, if I have to rephrase this question a little bit, what I would say is firms these days are trying to collect as much data as possible. From what I understand, and I'm not an expert in cybersecurity or collecting a lot of data, I would presume it would be much easier to handle and store and secure, let's say, small amount of data, just your name and addresses. But if I'm collecting everything from your Facebook activity details or social media details, is there some kind of trade-off there? That if I have large amounts of data collection, cybersecurity or my security of the data could be compromised at some extent. How do we manage this trade-off? Because we need extensive amounts of data, but we also need security. I would first like to Vibhu to comment on that, and then Dave on the same aspect.
I think very right in terms of that trade-off existing. So I think one, it is very, very important for all the stakeholders to be completely transparent in terms of what is the kind of data that they're collecting and what could it be used for. As a consumer, I need to be very, very sure that this is the kind of data that's being collected from me and it could be used for XYZ purposes. I think that transparency definitely needs to come in. And as we say today, I think in the world of big data, I think it also becomes important to get the right amount of data and not just collect everything in under the sun, right? So it also becomes important that we have the right dimensions of data from a need to know basis, which I believe could be helpful in solving certain problems. And then specifically from a COVID-19 perspective, I think the multiple issues that need to be tackled in terms of international laws and basically sharing of data would need to also be happening between different countries and kind of privacy laws that all of them have need. So there needs to be some central body which also manages those dimensions to be able to effectively leverage it to build ML and AI models on top of it to be able to fight this particular problem. So I think that's where I believe definitely there's a trade-off and there are different dimensions that we'll have to look at in terms of solving this.
Dave, what would you say about this trade-off?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Vibhu said about transparency. Let me back up a little bit and again reflect on the question that you posed when you said companies are collecting a lot of data. I wish that's the case. I am of the impression that companies are lost. They're not sure what they should collect, what they shouldn't collect. To give you hopefully a humorous example, I was doing some work with the healthcare group and I was having a chat with a senior executive and he said, Dave, we are so connected internally and externally. Our networks are so complex. We ourselves are lost. We don't know where we have important data, what our vulnerabilities are. In fact, it is my sincere hope we get breached, we get attacked, so we know where the vulnerabilities are. So I would be impressed if companies had a clear game plan in mind when they were collecting data and not just collecting any and every data. Again, Vibhu just does point to that as well. What is important is when it comes to storage, the first step is a company needs to know what is important to them from a standpoint of data collection. They need to prioritize. They need to do what is called, cataloging of assets and data. And then, given their resources, given the priorities, they should have security strategies. It's a myth that you have to have all the data in-house to have the most secure strategy. More importantly, you want a coordinated, a distributed security strategy that is anchored by a process where you are constantly backing up your critical data. I know of almost no company that doesn't leverage some kind of external resources for storage and security, which is a perfectly fine thing. They're probably better at that than the companies themselves. But having said that, you as a company, you cannot solely rely on those external service providers just in case something were to happen. So you have to have a very strong backup plan. To summarize, we are talking about a clear plan on what you want to collect and why. Second, being very transparent, having clear documentation, cataloging what's important, where these systems are, where what data is being stored, providing strong oversight, closely working with the vendors, having robust SLAs where the vendors should also make a commitment of securing the data, and they also have to have some consequences if there was going to be a breach. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Dave. That was really insightful. Companies and it's I believe it's fact that firms do not have what they need. They're just collecting things left, right, and center. But building on that, and we are coming to a close of the time. But humor me for a few more moments. Just a couple of more questions to wrap up. We have a question from Alka, and what she's trying to ask is, what is the gap? I think, Dave, it would be nice if you take that up. You did talk about the lack of preparedness, which might be dangerous for firms. And so, what the question is, what is the gap? Where is the gap that leads to lack in preparedness? Why are firms not prepared to handle epidemics of cybersecurity?
Yes, so I'm going to address it really quickly because we are short of time.
Yeah.
The number one factor is how actively committed and engaged are the top leadership. If there is no buy-in from top leadership, I can give it to you in writing, a company will not be successful in having a strong, resilient security strategy. So that's the number one gap, because the resources will flow from them. They will dictate, how it is going to be managed. The moment they adopt an approach which is check the box compliance approach, yes, we have to comply, so let's get something going. For instance, training. How customized, how personalized is the training? What is your form of assessment? How are you ensuring that people know what they need to know given the roles they are in? So that kind of genuine committed involvement is critical. To use a quick analogy, when you send your kids to school, you outsource the education. But unless you provide oversight, unless you deeply care, your kids will not turn out right. That is the kind of care, commitment that the top executives need to have for everything to flow through the organization. Because at the end of the day, they will have to lead the championing of preparedness.
Thanks, Steve. That was really enlightening. And in interest of time, we will take up the last question Maria has posed. That I think pertains maximum to Max. So Maria is talking about applications, apps for contact tracing. And most of the contact tracing apps so far have been deployed by national governments, and they have some sort of legitimacy at a national level. What Maria is trying to say is that, look, pandemic has been amplified due to international travel. It's an international problem in itself. So what are the kinds of implications that these apps have in terms of international law, and would countries share data, and what kind of implications do you see at international level for this?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question for the future. And I think it just shows how complicated this is going to be, but also what an opportunity it could be if it's organized right in terms of finding the right technological mechanism, but more importantly, the political mechanism to allocate this. So in the European Union, I could see at some point harmonization of apps, finding a common solution where these apps can interconnect with each other, and then sort of create a travel zone, for example, within the European Union, in the Schengen area, for example, where people then could use the same app and would have the information. But I think it's still some time away. But at least in Europe, we have the sort of political coordination mechanisms already in place. But on the international level, I think it's more complicated to find the right political entity that can organize this. But I think if the pandemic will be around for some more time, this will be an urgent need to develop also on the global international level some mechanism how an app could be used across borders. But I would also say that contact tracing is not only the app, it's also having still people in offices making calls to infected people to get tests and everything. So also this has to be taken into account.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Max. It is interesting. I think at some point in time, if this pandemic persists, and hopefully not, at some point in time, I think countries will have to come together to answer Mario's question, at some point countries will have to come together to create a legal framework, some sort of legal framework to justify cross-border data sharing, because cross-border data sharing will be required if we have to maintain cross-border contact tracing at some point. So it's definitely something that countries have to do. Today, there is no such law, from what I understand. These apps are still in their infancy, but at some point it would be required. I think that's what we can say right now. So that's all that we would have here today. Thanks a lot to all of you, Dave, Max, Vibhu. You have taken time off from your very, very busy schedules in these days, from different continents, to share with your insights. But I think that today's session has been very interesting and very insightful. What we are seeing is that companies are moving more and more towards data collection, and they need that data. And analytics is going to be very central in future for a lot of business activities, risk assessment, etc., but also for preparing firms for cybersecurity, for making firms secure, and that is essential. And yeah, ethically and legitimacy, the kind of issues that Max raised, they are very central. We hope that some sort of common ground is reached across countries to share this data in future. But thanks a lot to all of you for taking time out. It has been a real pleasure to have you all here on behalf of Trinity Research in Social Sciences, Trinity Business School. Thanks Dave and Vibhu for being here.
Thank you again. It's wonderful meeting all of you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Yeah, and for our attendees who are around, we do have a next week and a webinar on challenges to democracy. That's going to be very interesting. If you are interested in that, do register, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.